I am having today, coming up into the chair to talk with me, several different people. And I'd firstly like to invite Jane Horan, economic anthropologist from the University of Auckland Business School, to come forward. Please welcome Jane. Why are we driven to keep buying things we don't really need, using money we don't really have? Jane, please. Correct. Before we start, Jane, just I had to mention, of course, that she's the protege of an economist and anthropologist. You're an economic anthropologist yourself. Can you just define for me briefly what an economic anthropologist is?
Okay, I'm stunned that there's two economic anthropologists back to back at a conference like this. I guess you are too. I know, never before. Possibly half the people here haven't even heard of economic anthropology, so suddenly it's to the fore. Economic anthropologists look at a much broader brief. We look at economies, but we have a much wider brief than Western economics works within. So from my perspective, I work within a notion of human economy, which is where economic process, with sort of the movement of money, is nestled within and is only part of a much broader way of seeing the world. So what people value is a function of how they see themselves and how they see the world, rather than just value being stored in a thing like money. Which is where what we're going to be talking about here is consumerism. So when you talk about consumerism... Oh.
I don't want to stop you mid-flow. Apparently your cardigan is blocking your mic.
Oh, okay. Right. So my cardigan...
Will I clarify that?
Okay.
Just do a button up.
Just do a button up. Okay. All right. There we go. Does that help?
Janet Jackson, wardrobe malfunction, anyone? Right. You know, a good start today. Okay.
Not quite Janet Jackson, thank goodness. Okay.
Okay, sorry. See, ignorance, I told you.
Vacuous.
Apologies, Jane.
So I look at human economies, so this broader sort of brief of what's going on. So which is when we're going to be talking about consumerism. So spending is merely the one aspect of consumerism. So when you go and buy something, that act of exchanging money and not saving is merely one aspect of what consumerism is about. So.
All right. With that in mind, tell us about consumer culture. What exactly is it? And isn't it a contradiction in terms in some ways?
It is a bit. Let's just start with this slide here. Where are we going with slides? Okay, sorry. Just going back here. Start with that. Okay, so yes, and up to a point it is an oxymoron. It depends on how you look at what culture is, though. So from an because consumerism, from some perspectives, obliterates culture. But in actual fact, from an anthropological perspective, consumerism is culture. And in fact, in consumer societies, which is what pretty much the Western economies are, it is culture as we know it, which is a kind of a radical idea, really. So as a consumer society, it's a context where commodities, as in things that we buy as opposed to make, become incredibly important. So consumer culture, so this is a definition, I'll keep coming back to this through this presentation, is where things people buy are increasingly used to express core values of of that society, but are also the principal form through which people see, recognize, and understand value. So if somebody has a really big house, for example, people in that community recognize that that's a big thing. So it's this sort of mutual kind of relationship and sort of process that goes on within a community of people about recognizing what's valuable and what therefore is pegged to higher status or that sort of conceptualizing of what's
consumer
important.
culture then is defined by or expresses the core values of society, does that then define society?
Well, it depends on the extent of consumerism within that particular environment. Up to a point it does, and that's kind of a real sort of issue. And it also makes it very challenging to kind of get a sense of what to do about it. So, but one of the most difficult things about dealing with consumerism is the sheer scale of it, because it goes from the intensely personal, from a psychological perspective, right up to the planet, the size of the planet, the health of the planet. So let's just looking at where we got back to. There's my thing there. So this sort of, let's just look at that. Let's unpack that. So going back to what Ida was talking about, unpacking today, and this idea of where consumerism fits in with how we go about our day-to-day lives and how we see the world. So this sort of image looms large in our perception of what consumption is. So it's about excessive consumption, the impact of this on human beings, and it throws up the very real issues of degradation of the environment and global warming and the sort of constant extraction of resources and production in order to keep up with demand. So it's a pretty graphic image. So it's the impacts on human beings. Secondly, this sort of psychological thing. This intensely personal sort of process about what consumerism does and the gratification you get from buying a pair of shoes, as per the young woman in the video that we saw from the commission at the beginning of the beginning of today. So nothing haunts us like the things we don't buy. I mean, that is a thing, is kind of a terrifying reality, but...
This consumption is, this is learned behaviour, isn't it?
I'll get to that in a minute, because in fact, that's where the cultural construction of it comes in. So let's see this, this is also another part of the psychological thing. This idea that, you know, none of us are responsible for it. We do our thing, we might sort of recycle a little bit or whatever, but it's this sort of selfishness and sort of boundaries that we can have around sort of what consumerism is in our lives. And what about this one? Okay, so these are Instagram images. The one with the guy with the ridiculous number of watches and the one with the woman with the even more ridiculous number of sort of bags from high-end clothing stores came from an Instagram account called Rich Kids on Instagram. It's so these images are real images. They were posted on Instagram to be seen by other people, to be seen, to be consumed by others, to affect other people in some way or another. So that's essentially a social process to a certain extent. So there's these people were wanting to connect with other people in some way, a performance of what they're worth, performance of what they're able to buy, performance of what they're able to consume. So consumerism is fundamentally a social process. It's about an individual's identity as well as an individual's relationship to a group of people that they belong to. So it's not just about buying something or not, as the case may be, saving something. It's about this whole process of who you are fundamentally and how you see the world. So how you articulate identity, how you show love to the people that you surround yourself with, and how you belong to those people is what consumerism becomes about. So when you start talking about values and the materialization of those values in terms of valuables, as in things people kind of gather around themselves, you're getting to some very deep-seated sort of drivers behind the idea of demand and patterns of consumption. So you've got the psychological, so this is what I'm talking about in terms of scale. You've got the psychological going on, you've got the social going on, and I would argue, as an economic anthropologist, that you've also got this inherently cultural process happening as well. And we know that it's a cultural process because modes and methods of consumption around the world are very, very different. Even something as globalized as, say, Coca-Cola is consumed in very different ways around the world. Sort of the way that it's constructed in terms of status or calorific content, the value of it as a food can be very different depending on the cultural context that you're in. So consumption and the drive to buy are cultural constructs. And this is where we get back to this learned thing. They're essentially learned behaviours. So look at this slide of this little guy. Okay, this is a random image I found on the internet. Now, it's a kind of a striking image because here's this child nestled in amongst this incredible proliferation of toys and sort of stuff that I would guess that hasn't played with, but there's clearly a performance of parental sort of preferences, and who the parents are is what this collection of amazing colour-coordinated array of...
it's very red, white and blue, isn't it?
It is very red, white and blue, but
I
it's
mentioned the elections.
Superman, well, exactly, Superman-esque. So clearly the parents have got a fetish, perhaps, for Superman. But what the point is that, from an anthropological point of view, that's going on here is that this child's learning to consume in this way. No child is born knowing how to consume. No child is born knowing how to save either. These are learned behaviours. But the point that I'm making here too is that it's such a deep-seated thing that interfaces and coalesces with identity and belonging and love and seeing the world and being in the world, that it's in order to find solutions to this, you kind of have to go deep and broad in order to do something about it.
You've mentioned the drivers. What does drive us to keep buying things that we don't need?
Okay, so I mean, it's a huge question. So I'm going to come to an example in a minute, but I want to refer back to the slide I showed you before of Instagram, which brings up it's part of social media. The incredible nuances around the performance of status and the performance of identity that can be articulated through social media now are so powerful. One of the images of, I'll just go back and show you this woman, the young woman here. This is Gigi Hadid, who has 21.6 million Instagram followers. Whatever she wears, whatever she does, whatever she says gets followed by these 21.6 million people, to the extent that she is this incredible sort of assemblage of performance piece, clothes horse, and commercial machinery to sell products in a way that, she hasn't even reached her zenith, and it's tracking. She's changing sort of week by week. Her capacity to influence people is going stellar. It's just an incredible kind of process to watch this happening, and it's changing all the time.
This is very much a millennial thing. I'm looking in the audience, no offence to anybody, but there aren't a hell of a lot of millennials here. Are we in a position to judge them?
I'm not judging, but I'm fascinated by it, and I'm certainly learning from millennials, because millennials have a very interesting way of approaching the world. Do we judge them? I'm not judging her, and I'm following her on Instagram because I find her fascinating.
You're perpetuating the phenomenon then.
Maybe I am, but I'm also, I sort of stand by the fact that I'm a researcher as well, so but I am fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by this sort of the astonishing evolution of it, and that it's changing week by week. And
that evolution is very rapid though, isn't it?
Incredibly so. And we've never really been in an era where something like social media and the capacity of a cell phone to affect our worlds and change the way we experience the world. So a cell phone is not just a piece of technology, it has completely altered the way we experience and exist in the world.
I think you have an example too of the role of social media, don't you?
Well, yeah, I'm going to look at
very modern context.
Here. So this was H&M. Opened here in New Zealand the weekend before last. Now, I want to look at this example because it's bringing the global economy into New Zealand, and I'll explain why that's a little bit of a big deal. But also, it's an interesting thing because of the role of social media in this, but also the wider media as well, and the process of sort of the arrival of H&M and the way that it got. It was being pegged and heralded, and they've got an astonishing public relations team. But the way it was being heralded even a year out from the opening, sort of the weekend before last. So this was in a shopping mall, the largest shopping mall in New Zealand, called Sylvia Park here in Auckland. The shopping mall extended its hours. So there was this whole sort of ramping up of consumerism and sort of the commercial process of it. So H&M is the second largest clothing company in the world. They're a Swedish company. They have something like 4,100 retail outlets around the world. Now, presumably 4,101 because of the New Zealand one. It's huge, and it was a really big deal for it to come here. They have an enormous online presence as well. So as a New Zealander, you could buy online if you really wanted to. But suddenly the shop comes to New Zealand, and it's a really big deal. New Zealand we have at times an inferiority complex. We feel like we're at the end of the world. But suddenly if a clothing store like H&M's coming, we feel good about ourselves, oddly enough. It's a weird thing. And it's kind of scary as well when you begin to unpack what that means. So this opening ceremony kind of began to approach. And the week out from the opening ceremony, there was incredible media coverage of it. It was being covered in on the news. I'm sure you read news items about it. It was being covered in fashion magazines. There was bloggers that had been sent to Sweden to sort of cover it, and they were writing about it. It was just kind of escalating. There was preview shopping events for VIPs, etc., etc. The night before the opening, people began to queue to get into to be there at the opening the night before, so at least 12 hours out from the opening of the doors. So they slept at the shopping mall through the night so that they could be amongst the first to sort of arrive. Then the next day, over 1,000, close to 1,500 people apparently arrived for the event, and it was this enormous entertainment experience. But it was for the opening of a shop. which is kind of an extraordinary thing. But you've got this full spectrum of what consumerism is about, all the scales of consumerism were going on there, this intensely personal belonging that people who were assembling there, who wanted to be part of the crowd, were sort of joining in to be part of that. Right up to there was also a group of protesters there who were protesting the fast fashion nature of H&M. H&M have this incredible capacity and group of designers who can see something on the catwalk, go away, design it, get it produced and have it in the shop for a fraction of the price point that it would sell in the high-end shopping shops for to be available to be consumed.
Let's put that into a wider context because we're running short on time.
Sure.
How do you define those changes in attitudes that we've seen over the past 50 years and increasingly over the past 25? And if you look at the advent of the internet and its disruptive influence over the last 5 to 10.
Okay, so let's look at some figures. Okay, I'll read off a few statistics here because we live in a neoliberal environment. And this is how it's expressed in terms of clothing. In the 1950s, an average woman in America apparently had 9 outfits worth of clothing. By now, they have something like 30 to 40 different outfits of clothing. That's an enormous increase. So 50 years ago, Americans now apparently consume 3 times as much as their ancestors did 50 years ago. And twice as much as 20 years ago. In 1991, the average American bought 34 items of clothing a year. In 2007, it had doubled to 67 items of clothing a year. That's a new item of clothing every couple of days. It's 2016, maybe it's even doubled again, which is an astonishing amount of clothing. So over the last 5 years, the top 2 fashion retail outlets, which is Zara's number 1, number 2 is H&M, have grown 9.7%.
So this growth is almost exponential. What can we actually do to close things off, what can we do about rampant consumerism? How do we address it? Do we need to address it?
We do. Well, the point that I'm making, I guess, is that if you begin to look at consumerism as a cultural phenomenon, you're blowing out the frames of reference of what consumerism is. So it's not just about buying stuff or the opposite of that, saving. It's about identifying the processes of belonging and identity and the connections that people have to consumerism. So when you begin to sort of deal with the scales, you're blowing it right out and making it incredibly complex, but you then arguably produce some more different insights and you can ask different questions. So you begin to, so there's all these sorts of alternatives. So this is, we'll move on from that one. These are the sorts of things that are here because there's a whole lot of anti-consumerism movements. Some people say chuck out capitalism. That's not really a solution. But the fact that there's a difference between capitalism and the processes of the market, there's something to work with there. But the thing about blowing it right out and getting a fix on the cultural construction of consumerism means that you can begin to ask a different set of questions. So accommodating the scale of consumption makes it possible to ask these different questions because human economy is about people and their well-being. So what if financial capability was an outcome of a set of processes that were driving cultural change? So rather than being the solution, financial capability, it was an outcome. So you begin to sort of address people's senses of belonging and sense of self-esteem and identity. So in terms of retirement, for example, could retirement not be about having enough money? So don't make it about having enough money, but about learning to live with as little as possible in a comfortable, happy way. Maybe we need a different world, I don't know, but I'm more hopeful than that. So we'll leave it there.
One quick question,
Sure.
It's just a yes or no. Are you optimistic about the future?
I am, but I'm a glass half full kind of a person.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please put your hands together for the glass half full. Jane Horan. Thank you.